These days, we feel a strange sense of comfort when we hear the phrase Robin Hood state. Just tax more and redistribute. The moment we hear that, the world feels slightly more just. But perhaps we need to change the question. Does Robin Hood state simply make us feel better? Does it actually solve the real problem, especially wealth inequality? Or is it simply opening the door to a worse future? Today, instead of reacting rather emotionally, we change lenses and examine the structure. When we say inequality, what exactly do we mean? And does the Robin Hood prescription truly address that problem? Again, we approach this from four lenses. 1. The measurement lens. Inequality is not a single, unified concept. Number 2. The fiscal dependence lens. Tax more sounds virtuous, but it can become structurally risky. 3. The growth and innovation lens. The real question isn't how much more, but where is the point that damages the engine? 4th, the meta political lens. When this debate hardens into division, the braking mechanism disappears. So from this point forward, this ain't about opinion. It's more about what each lens reveals and what it tries to hide. First, the measurement lens. The first trap in inequality debates is this. We compress fundamentally different phenomena into a single word, inequality. Because in reality, there are at least 4 distinct forms. 1. The pre-tax income inequality. How much people earn in the market. 2. After-tax income inequality. The gap after taxes and transfers. 3. Consumption inequality. The gap in actual living standards and spending. And lastly, number 4, wealth inequality. Disparities in scarce assets like housing, stocks, and land. Now, let's look at this data. In the US, the top 1% share of pre-tax income rose from roughly 9% in the 1980s to about 16% in 2022. In Europe, the top 1% share rose from around 8% to roughly 12%. So if we stop here, the conclusion seems rather obvious. Inequality has worsened. But we need to also look at after-tax, the post-tax measures. Because in some countries, the after-tax inequality has stabilized or even declined. If we look at the UK, for example, it fell by around 3 percentage points. In France, about 4. Why? The mechanism is straightforward. 1. More progressive taxation. 2. Expanded transfers such as pensions, unemployment insurance, healthcare, and child benefits. And lastly, especially the rise of public pension spending in aging societies. In other words, market inequality may have widened, but the state has partially offset it. Yet, people still feel that inequality is getting worse. Why? Because the emotional trigger is often wealth and not income. Let's look at consumer goods. They've become cheaper due to mass production, the spread of technology, and prices fall. But when we look at scarce assets, for example, real estate in urban areas, are physically limited. TVs and electronics can be produced in greater supply. But we look at Seoul or downtown Manhattan, we can't do that. So scarcity turns into competition, and competition quickly turns into exclusion. People may see post-tax income gaps narrowing, but when access to scarce assets becomes slimmer, inequality feels more intense. Okay, good. So now let's move forward to the second lens. What structure does taxing more actually create? And we call this the fiscal dependence lens. Around the world, the demand to tax the rich repeat because of one belief. If we collect more, we can solve the problem. Now, that may be true, but we still need to examine the structure. In several countries, the top 1% already contributes an extraordinarily large share of income tax revenue. We look at Korea, for example. Roughly 40% of income tax revenue comes from the top 1%. The US, roughly about the same, 40%. UK, about 27%. Now, this isn't an argument for or against redistribution, but it's talking more about the structure of it. The state may already be heavily dependent on a very narrow tax base. And from there are two paths. One, the success path. Now, this tax revenue flows into education, childcare, training, and infrastructure that raise productivity. And second is the failure path. The revenue flows into short-term, politically popular spending and increasing dependency without strengthening capacity. So the critical question is not whether we should tax more, but it's about whether there is a clear transmission mechanism. For instance, the questions like, does human capital actually improve? Do bottlenecks in housing, education, and labor markets ease? Or does short-term satisfaction increase without actual structural change? Now, taxing more, yes, it can sound morally compelling. But without a growth pathway, it's simply an incomplete policy design. Now let's look at the third lens. This is no longer about fairness, but it's more about the engine of the system. The growth and innovation lens. Now, taxes are moral instruments, but they are also economic design. We raise rates and you may increase revenue. But what you do is you also change behavior. Research shows that a 1 percentage point increase in income tax rates is associated with roughly a 0.6 percentage point decrease in patterning probability over the following 3 years. Innovation doesn't disappear overnight, but incentives matter. Another important point is most of the value created by innovators spill over to society. So the personal capture rate is often estimated to be very small, sometimes around 2%. This isn't an argument for blanket tax cuts, but it's a reminder of trade-offs. When tax policy changes, what we may be affecting is not simply the wealth of today's high-income earners, but the scale of tomorrow's innovation. Because if innovation slows, there are consequences, such as reduced investment, lower quality job creation, fewer opportunities for younger generations, and eventually a weaker tax base to fund the redistribution itself. So if we attempt to reduce inequality today, but undermine the growth engine, the long-term distributional outcome may become worse. So the real standard isn't how much more do we want to collect, but it is more, so where is the point where we begin damaging growth? And the debate doesn't end here. And our final lens hopefully explains why. It's the meta-political lens. Inequality debates often shift from economics to political strategy. The rich versus the ordinary, taxpayers versus beneficiaries, elites and justice. The danger here isn't about disagreement, but the danger is in the erosion of institutional brakes. If the middle class comes to believe that it bears little cost while benefits expand broadly, the political constraint on spending weakens. Policies often work in this way. Benefits are visible and widespread. Costs are concentrated or delayed. Now, under those conditions, expansion becomes politically attractive. Let's look at Greece during its sovereign debt crisis. Public spending grew, particularly on pensions and public sector commitments. Revenue collection and growth capacity did not keep pace. And when the global financial shock hit, borrowing costs spiked, austerity flowed, unemployment surged, youth immigration accelerated. The intention wasn't to collapse, but weak fiscal foundations eventually met external shock. Argentina presents another pattern. Repeated fiscal deficits combined with monetary instability, and it eroded trust. Inflation cycles followed, and the core mechanism was persistent spending expansion without a stable revenue and credibility base. Now, the conclusion isn't about moral condemnation, but it's a warning about the structure. Yes, a Robin Hood state may provide moral satisfaction, but when political polarization erodes fiscal discipline, then it weakens the system's stabilizers. And when stabilizers fail, the adjustment is often harsher than the original inequality itself. Now, before we conclude today, let's ask ourselves, which lens are we using? Because today we saw pre-tax inequality can rise, and post-tax inequality can be moderated through redistribution, but perceived injustice often centers on scarce wealth assets. and calls and demands to tax more must account for growth incentives and political constraint. So here's the question. When we say inequality, are we talking about income or wealth? And in the next episode, we'll move from slogans to design.